Did you know that Henry VIII originally intended to be a loyal Catholic king? Or that Elizabeth I was never supposed to rule at all? The Tudor story isn't just history, it's a shocking series of accidents, betrayals, and unexpected turns that nearly collapsed at every generation. From Henry VII's improbable victory at Bosworth to Elizabeth's decision to remain the Virgin Queen, this documentary follows every critical moment of the 118-year Tudor rule. You'll witness how a dynasty born in bloodshed transformed England from a medieval kingdom into a modern nation-state. England in 1455 stood at the edge of chaos. For 30 years, the country descended into what we now call the Wars of the Roses, a devastating series of battles, betrayals, and political maneuvers between two branches of the royal Plantagenet family. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster became symbols of a conflict that tore England apart and decimated its nobility. This wasn't simply a fight between two families. The Wars of the Roses emerged from deeper issues. A weak king in Henry VI, who suffered periods of mental illness, powerful nobles with private armies, and questions about royal succession that had never been fully resolved. As battles raged across England, the casualty list grew to include many of the country's most powerful families. By some estimates, nearly 80% of the English nobility were killed or ruined during this period. The conflict seemed endless. Edward IV of York seized the throne in 1461, lost it in 1470, then reclaimed it in 1471. When he died unexpectedly in 1483, his brother Richard took the crown from Edward's young sons, the famous princes in the Tower, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. This usurpation created an opportunity for Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian with a distant and complicated claim to the throne. Henry Tudor's story doesn't fit the traditional hero narrative. Born in Wales in 1457 to Margaret Beaufort, who was just 13 years old at his birth, and Edmund Tudor, who died before Henry was born, his royal blood came through an illegitimate line that had been legitimized by royal decree. After the Yorkist victories of the 1460s, the young Henry fled to Brittany, where he lived in exile for 14 years. There, he waited and watched the English political situation, gathering supporters and planning his return. The decisive moment came on August 22, 1485, at Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor, with an army of around 5,000 men, many of them French mercenaries, faced King Richard III's larger force of approximately 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers. The battle turned when the powerful Stanley family, who had remained neutral until the critical moment, sided with Henry. Richard III, seeing his position collapsing, made a desperate charge directly at Henry. The king fought bravely but was killed in the attempt, the last English monarch to die in battle. With Richard dead, Henry was crowned on the battlefield with the fallen king's circlet. He moved quickly to secure his position, declaring his reign had begun the day before the battle, thereby making all who fought against him guilty of treason. He married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the two warring houses and creating the Tudor Dynasty. The marriage was both a political masterstroke and genuinely successful, unusual for royal unions of this period. Henry VII brought innovations to English kingship that deserve more attention. He was crowned before Parliament met, making it clear his authority came from victory, not from their approval. Few know that Henry carried a red dragon standard at Bosworth, connecting himself to Welsh prophecies about the return of a native ruler to Britain. By linking himself to Arthurian legend, Henry gained support among the Welsh, while presenting himself as a semi-mythical figure to the English. The Wars of the Roses had a surprising archaeological epilogue in 2012, when researchers discovered Richard III's remains beneath a parking lot in Leicester. His skeleton showed evidence of scoliosis and numerous battle wounds, confirming contemporary accounts of both his physical appearance and violent death. The discovery provided physical evidence of the moment when Plantagenet rule ended and the Tudor age began, a reminder that the dramatic events that shaped nations can sometimes be buried just beneath our feet. When Henry VII claimed the throne in 1485, England was exhausted by 3 decades of civil war. Unlike previous kings who seized power, Henry didn't celebrate with lavish tournaments or military campaigns. Instead, he began the patient work of rebuilding a broken kingdom through careful administration, strategic diplomacy, and financial discipline. Henry understood that winning the crown was only the first step. Keeping it required establishing legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects and foreign powers. His marriage to Elizabeth of York united the warring houses, but Henry went further by creating new royal symbols. The Tudor rose, combining the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, appeared on buildings, documents, and royal clothing, a constant visual reminder that the civil wars were over and a new era had begun. The new king faced an immediate problem. Many nobles still commanded private armies and harbored Yorkist sympathies. Rather than executing potential enemies, Henry developed a system of bonds and recognizances, essentially financial guarantees of good behavior. Nobles signed agreements promising large sums of money if they rebelled or broke the king's peace. This ingenious system meant potential troublemakers either remained loyal or faced financial ruin. One nobleman, Lord Burgevany, found himself under a recognizance of £70,000, several million in today's money, for maintaining illegal retainers. Henry also established the Court of Star Chamber, a special court that operated directly under royal authority. Named for the stars painted on its ceiling, this court bypassed traditional legal procedures to address cases that regular courts couldn't effectively handle, particularly when powerful nobles were involved. While later Tudor monarchs would use the Star Chamber as a tool of oppression, under Henry VII, it mainly provided justice in cases where local courts would have been intimidated. Rather than pursuing expensive foreign wars, Henry strengthened England's position through marriage alliances. In 1501, his eldest son Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The Spanish alliance gave England valuable trading benefits and protection against France. Henry arranged for his daughter Margaret to marry King James IV of Scotland, hoping to secure peace on England's northern border. Henry's meticulous attention to financial matters became legendary. His personal account books survive, showing he tracked royal expenses down to pennies. Records show payments of 4 shillings to a woman who brought the king strawberries, 2 pounds to his fool, court jester, and even 4 shillings for food for the royal monkeys. This attention to detail helped transform the nearly bankrupt treasury he inherited into one containing approximately £1.5 million at his death, an enormous sum for the time. Despite his careful governance, Henry faced several serious threats. Lambert Simnel, a boy taught to impersonate the Earl of Warwick, a potential Yorkist claimant, gathered significant support in 1487. After defeating Simnel's forces, Henry merely employed the boy as a kitchen servant, a clever propaganda move that highlighted the absurdity of the pretender's claims. A more serious threat came from Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes supposedly murdered in the Tower. Warbeck gained support from foreign powers, including Scotland and the Holy Roman Empire, before Henry captured and eventually executed him in 1499. When Henry VII died in 1509, he left a transformed England. The treasury was full, administrative systems functioned efficiently, the nobility was controlled, and the Tudor Dynasty was secured through multiple international marriages. While not as famous as his son Henry VIII or granddaughter Elizabeth I, Henry VII's achievements were remarkable. He built the foundations that allowed the Tudor dynasty to flourish. A strange postscript to Henry's reign came in 1869, when his tomb was opened during renovations at Westminster Abbey. Workers found his body in an extraordinary state of preservation, looking almost lifelike. Unfortunately, this unique historical artifact was destroyed in 1941 when a German bomb struck the building where it was stored. On April 21, 1509, Henry VII died, and his only surviving son inherited the throne. The new King Henry VIII was just 17 years old, tall, athletic, and remarkably different from his cautious father. London celebrated as the young monarch rode through the streets. After decades of his father's financial restraint, Henry VIII immediately signaled a new era by spending lavishly. He ordered the release of political prisoners, distributed money to the poor, and planned tournaments that would showcase his physical prowess. The contrast between father and son could hardly have been more striking. Where Henry VII had been reserved and calculating, the young Henry VIII was exuberant and impulsive. The old king had focused on filling the treasury. The new king seemed eager to empty it. Henry VII had worn plain clothing and avoided public spectacles. His son commissioned elaborate outfits covered in jewels and organized entertainment on a scale England had never seen before. Within weeks of his coronation, Henry fulfilled his father's diplomatic plans by marrying Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who had briefly been married to his older brother, Arthur, before his death. The marriage reinforced England's alliance with Spain and provided Henry with a queen who was 6 years his senior and experienced in royal duties. The match seemed to satisfy both political necessity and personal preference. The young king appeared genuinely fond of Catherine. Henry's education had prepared him for more than just kingship. He received training in languages, mathematics, astronomy, theology, and music. He could speak fluent Latin and French, compose music, and engage in theological debates. These weren't merely academic exercises. Henry composed dozens of musical pieces that survive today, including Pastime with Good Company, which became a popular song at his court. He owned nearly 20 musical instruments and could play many of them skillfully. Physical activities consumed much of the young king's time. He stood over 6 feet tall, exceptionally tall for the 16th century, with broad shoulders and powerful legs. An accomplished wrestler, archer, and horseman, Henry particularly excelled at jousting. These weren't merely sports for Henry, but opportunities to embody the medieval chivalric ideals he admired. During tournaments, he competed under names like Sir Loyalheart, connecting himself to the mythical knights of Arthurian legend. The king's physical appearance matched his larger-than-life personality. The Venetian ambassador described him as the handsomest prince in Christendom, noting his auburn hair, fair skin, and a round face so beautiful that it would become a pretty woman. Unlike many monarchs who ruled through advisors, the young Henry actively participated in government from the beginning, sitting in council meetings and reading diplomatic dispatches. Henry's early court attracted some of Europe's finest thinkers. He appointed the humanist scholar Thomas More as a royal counselor and corresponded with the Dutch philosopher Erasmus, who praised the king's learning and judgment. These relationships were more than ceremonial. Henry participated in intellectual debates and showed genuine interest in Renaissance ideas about education, governance, and religion. The early years of Henry's reign created an image that conflicts with our modern perception of the king. Rather than the tyrannical, corpulent figure of his later years, the young Henry was widely admired across Europe. Foreign ambassadors reported on his intelligence, physical abilities, and charm. His court was filled with music, art, philosophical discussions, and athletic competitions. Even religious reformers saw potential in him, hoping his intellectual curiosity might make him sympathetic to new ideas. Few could have predicted how dramatically this Renaissance prince would transform, or the far-reaching changes his personal desires would soon trigger across England. Henry VIII wanted more than just a crown. He wanted glory. By 1511, Europe was engulfed in the War of the Holy League, with Pope Julius II organizing an alliance against France. The young English king seized this opportunity to revive ancient English claims to the French throne, dreams that echoed the victories of Henry V a century earlier. In June 1513, Henry led an army of 30,000 men across the English Channel, hoping to write his name into the history books alongside his medieval heroes. The resulting Battle of the Spurs, fought near Thérouanne in northern France, hardly matched Henry's grand expectations. When English forces encountered French cavalry on August 16th, the French troops retreated so quickly that English propagandists claimed they used their spurs more than their weapons. This minor skirmish was transformed by Tudor propaganda into a significant victory. Henry captured the towns of Thérouanne and Tournai, but these gains came at enormous expense and would later be traded away in future negotiations. While Henry pursued limited glory in France, his wife Catherine of Aragon was managing a far more serious threat. Taking advantage of England's involvement in Europe, King James IV of Scotland invaded northern England with approximately 30,000 men. Catherine organized the English defense, appearing before troops in armor and giving rousing speeches despite being pregnant. On September 9, 1513, English forces under the Earl of Surrey met the Scottish army at Flodden Field. The battle ended in catastrophe for Scotland, with James IV killed alongside much of Scottish nobility. Nearly 10,000 Scots died compared to around 1,500 English casualties. This decisive victory, won while Henry was abroad, demonstrated Catherine's political acumen and secured England's northern border for years. Behind much of Henry's early foreign policy stood Thomas Wolsey, a butcher's son whose remarkable intelligence and administrative skills propelled him to unprecedented power. By 1515, Wolsey had accumulated the positions of Lord Chancellor, Cardinal, and Papal Legate, effectively controlling both church and state in England. Wolsey crafted a foreign policy that positioned England as a power broker between larger European rivals, particularly Spain and France. This approach brought England greater influence than its military or economic strength might otherwise have warranted. The most spectacular display of Henry's diplomatic ambitions came in June 1520 at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a summit meeting with the French King Francis I. For 3 weeks, the two monarchs attempted to outshine each other with displays of wealth and athletic prowess in the fields between Guines and Ardres, near Calais. Henry commissioned a temporary palace with glass windows and real plumbing. The English brought 6,000 men and almost 3,000 horses. Wine flowed from fountains, and both kings participated in wrestling matches and jousting tournaments. Despite its splendor, the meeting produced no lasting diplomatic results. Within 2 years, England and France were again at war. The European political landscape grew increasingly complex as Henry's reign progressed. The Habsburg ruler Charles V controlled Spain, the Netherlands, part of Italy, and was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, creating a power that encircled France. Henry briefly considered pursuing the imperial title himself, but his kingdom lacked the resources and influence to compete with Charles. Instead, England found itself courted by both Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and Francis I of France, each seeking an alliance against the other. By the 1520s, Henry's dreams of military glory had faded. His campaigns had drained the treasury his father had so carefully filled. The European political situation had grown more complicated, with powers too large for England to challenge directly. Still in his physical prime, Henry continued to compete in tournaments and present himself as the chivalric king his education and youth had prepared him to be. By 1525, Henry VIII faced a serious problem. After 16 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he had only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. For a king obsessed with his dynasty's future, this situation was intolerable. The Tudor claim to the throne remained relatively new, and memories of the Wars of the Roses lingered. Without a male heir, Henry feared England might again descend into civil war after his death. Catherine had experienced multiple pregnancies, including several miscarriages, stillbirths, and the deaths of infants soon after birth. By 1525, she was 40 years old and unlikely to conceive again. Henry, increasingly desperate, began to question the validity of his marriage. He focused on a passage from Leviticus, stating that if a man marries his brother's wife, they shall remain childless. Since Catherine had previously been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, who died in 1502, the king argued this biblical curse explained his lack of sons. Henry overlooked a critical fact. Pope Julius II had granted a special dispensation for his marriage to Catherine, specifically addressing the issue of her previous marriage. The king now claimed this dispensation was invalid because no pope had the authority to overrule divine law. His argument contained a convenient logic. If the marriage had always been invalid, Henry could pursue a new wife without the stigma of divorce, which the Catholic Church prohibited. The king's case was complicated by international politics. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, controlled much of Europe and effectively held Pope Clement VII as a political prisoner after sacking Rome in 1527. The Pope, caught between Henry's demands and Charles's pressure, delayed making a decision for years, hoping the English king might lose interest or the political situation might change. Henry grew increasingly frustrated as papal proceedings dragged on with no resolution. Meanwhile, he had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. Unlike her sister Mary, who had previously been Henry's mistress, Anne refused to surrender to the king outside marriage. This resistance only increased Henry's determination to end his first marriage and make Anne his queen. The breakthrough in Henry's great matter came through two key advisors, Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. Cromwell, a brilliant administrator and lawyer, developed a revolutionary approach. Rather than continue fighting through papal courts, he suggested Henry should declare himself the supreme authority over the Church in England. Cranmer, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, quickly declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, allowing the king to marry Anne, who was already pregnant with the future Elizabeth I. Between 1532 and 1534, Parliament passed a series of acts separating the English Church from Rome. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 officially established Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. This radical step marked the beginning of the English Reformation, though Henry personally remained largely Catholic in his religious beliefs. The irony of Henry's break with Rome was striking. Just 13 years earlier, in 1521, Pope Leo X had awarded Henry the title Defender of the Faith for writing a book defending Catholic sacraments against Martin Luther's criticisms. This title, still used by British monarchs today, was given to a king who would soon reject papal authority entirely. Henry's quest for an annulment transformed England's religious landscape permanently. What began as a personal matter of succession became a national revolution. Yet the king's motives remained dynastic rather than theological. While religious reformers saw an opportunity to introduce Protestant ideas into England, Henry primarily wanted control over his marriage and the future of his dynasty. The religious changes he set in motion, however, would expand far beyond his original intentions, ultimately reshaping English identity and setting the stage for conflicts that would dominate the next century. Anne Boleyn transformed England more profoundly than almost any royal consort in history. She entered Henry VIII's court around 1522 as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, bringing with her French education and Renaissance ideas. Unlike many women at court, Anne showed little interest in becoming merely another of Henry's mistresses. Her refusal to follow her sister Mary's path into the king's bed created both frustration and fascination for Henry, who pursued her for nearly 7 years before they married. Anne was more than a love interest. She possessed political intelligence and religious conviction that shaped royal policy. She maintained connections with continental reformers and promoted like-minded individuals for church positions, further embedding reformist influence at the heart of the Tudor court. Her role as queen gave her a platform to encourage the spread of Protestant literature and ideas, reinforcing Henry's break from Rome in ways that extended far beyond personal motives. In January 1533, Anne and Henry married in a secret ceremony. She was already pregnant, making the timing critical. Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid in May, and Anne was crowned queen in June. In September, she gave birth to a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. The birth disappointed Henry, who had convinced himself Anne would deliver the son he desperately wanted. Anne's coronation marked the culmination of dramatic religious changes. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534, officially establishing Henry as head of the Church of England. Thomas Cromwell began dissolving monasteries and redirecting their wealth to the crown. English Bibles appeared in churches, and the Mass underwent revisions. These changes, while initiated for Henry's personal reasons, carried significant theological implications that Anne supported. Court politics quickly turned against the new queen. Anne's sharp intelligence and willingness to express opinions created enemies. Her failure to produce a male heir weakened her position. By 1536, Henry's attention had shifted to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, recognized that her faction threatened his influence and worked to remove her. In April 1536, Cromwell arrested several men of the Queen's household, including her brother George, on charges of adultery with Anne. The accusations expanded to include incest and plotting the king's death. The evidence was flimsy. Later analysis shows that Anne wasn't even present at some locations where alleged affairs took place. Nevertheless, on May 15th, Anne faced trial before a court of peers, who unanimously found her guilty. 4 days later, Anne walked to a scaffold erected on Tower Green. In an unprecedented move, Henry arranged for a French swordsman to perform the execution, rather than using an English axeman. This strange mercy, ensuring a skilled single stroke rather than the potentially multiple blows an axeman might require, stands as one of history's most bizarre expressions of consideration. Anne maintained her composure to the end, making a brief speech acknowledging the king's goodness to her, but never confessing to any crimes. With a single stroke, she became the first English queen executed by her husband. Her body received no formal burial. Workers placed her remains in an arrow chest and buried her in the Tower Chapel. Anne's physical appearance contributed to myths that followed her death. Contemporary accounts mention a slight mole on her neck and possibly an extra nail or small sixth finger. These minor features transformed in hostile accounts into evidence of witchcraft and demonic influence. The speed of her rise and fall, less than 3 years as queen, created a legacy that continues to fascinate historians. The aftermath of Anne's execution revealed its political nature. Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days later. Parliament passed the Second Succession Act, declaring both Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate. Anne's dramatic fall established a precedent of royal ruthlessness that would characterize the remainder of Henry's reign and permanently alter the relationship between monarch and court. In 1536, Thomas Cromwell launched the most sweeping appropriation of property in English history. Under Henry VIII's authority, commissioners traveled across England, visiting monasteries, abbeys, priories, and convents that had stood for centuries. These religious houses controlled approximately 1/4 of England's landed wealth and served as centers of education, charity, and spiritual life. Within 5 years, over 800 of these institutions closed permanently, their property seized by the Crown. The official justification presented to the public focused on moral failings. Cromwell's commissioners produced the Compendium Compertorum, a document cataloging alleged abuses within monasteries, monks breaking vows of chastity, financial mismanagement, and religious superstitions. Many modern historians question the accuracy of these reports, noting that commissioners assessed hundreds of monasteries in impossibly short timeframes, suggesting predetermined conclusions rather than genuine investigation. The dissolution proceeded in 2 phases. The first targeted smaller houses with annual incomes under £200, affecting about 300 institutions. Henry and Cromwell calculated that smaller monasteries would face less resistance during closure. The second phase, beginning in 1538, pursued the wealthy abbeys and priories that dominated local economies across England. Monks and nuns received small pensions or transferred to surviving houses. Abbots who resisted faced execution for treason, including those from Reading, Colchester, and Glastonbury. The elimination of monasteries created immediate social disruption. These institutions had provided crucial social services, educating children, caring for the sick, supporting the elderly, and feeding the poor. When monasteries closed, these services vanished, creating hardship in many communities. Monastic libraries containing thousands of manuscripts were destroyed or dispersed, resulting in an incalculable loss of knowledge and historical records. Public reaction turned violent in October 1536, when northern counties erupted in the Pilgrimage of Grace, the largest popular uprising of Tudor England. Approximately 30,000 people marched under the banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of monasteries and traditional religious practices. Henry initially negotiated with the rebels, promising pardons. Once they dispersed, he ordered brutal reprisals, executing hundreds of participants, including their leader, lawyer Robert Aske, who was hanged in chains at York. The financial windfall for Henry VIII was staggering. From monastery properties, the crown acquired land worth approximately £90,000 in annual income, more wealth than all previous kings of England had possessed combined. Henry used this fortune to build coastal fortifications, fund wars in France and Scotland, and construct lavish palaces. Yet much of this wealth quickly disappeared through poor management, inflation, and continued military expenditures. The Dissolution transformed English society by creating a new class of landowners loyal to Tudor rule. While Henry retained prime properties for the crown, Cromwell sold much former church land to merchants, lawyers, and minor gentry. These new landowners had direct financial interest in preventing any Catholic restoration that might reclaim church properties. This redistribution essentially created a powerful constituency committed to religious reform, or at least to maintaining the new status quo. Despite dismantling monasteries, Henry maintained contradictory religious positions throughout the Dissolution. He rejected papal authority while enforcing traditional Catholic doctrines, like transubstantiation. This inconsistency created a hybrid church, neither fully Reformed nor traditionally Catholic. Monks who surrendered peacefully often received positions in the new church structure as deans or prebendaries. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal details about this tumultuous period. Excavations have uncovered hidden caches of relics and treasures that monks attempted to protect from confiscation. In 1939, workers at Cheapside in London discovered a jeweled cross and other valuables deliberately hidden during the Dissolution. Abbey ruins across England, like Fountains, Rival, and Tintern, stand as physical reminders of this massive transfer of power from church to state, monuments to a religious revolution that permanently altered England's spiritual and physical landscape. The transformation of Henry VIII from energetic Renaissance prince to paranoid tyrant represents one of history's most dramatic personal declines. By the 1540s, the once athletic king could barely walk. A jousting accident in 1536 reopened an old leg wound that never properly healed, developing into a chronic ulcer. Court physicians applied various treatments, including cauterization with hot irons and regular draining, which provided temporary relief but no cure. This constant pain likely contributed to Henry's increasingly erratic behavior and violent temper. The king's physical appearance changed drastically. His final suit of armor, still displayed at the Tower of London, reveals a 54-inch waist, triple the size of his athletic youth. By 1546, Henry weighed nearly 400 pounds and required a mechanical hoist to move him between floors at his palaces. Servants constructed specially reinforced chairs and widened doorways to accommodate his size. Despite his immobility, Henry continued eating enormous meals, often consuming multiple courses of game meats, pastries, and sweetmeats at a single sitting. Henry's psychological state deteriorated alongside his body. The confident king who once welcomed debate and counsel grew increasingly suspicious of those around him. In 1540, he ordered the execution of Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant administrator who had engineered the break with Rome and dissolution of monasteries. Cromwell's primary offense was arranging Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose portrait the king found attractive, but whose actual appearance disappointed him. Henry divorced Anne after just 6 months and executed Cromwell weeks later. The king's marital history reflects his changing temperament. Jane Seymour, his third wife, died shortly after giving birth to his son Edward in 1537. Anne of Cleves became his fourth wife in 1540 before their rapid divorce. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, faced execution in 1542 when her premarital relationships came to light. Catherine Parr, who married Henry in 1543, survived him partly through careful management of his unpredictable moods. She fostered reconciliation between Henry and his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both previously declared illegitimate, and promoted education at court. Henry's paranoia extended beyond his immediate circle. In 1538 to 1541, he executed Henry Pole, Lord Montagu, along with his family members, distant Plantagenet cousins who represented potential alternative claimants to the throne. The elderly Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, faced a particularly horrific execution in 1541 when the inexperienced executioner required multiple blows to complete his task. These killings effectively eliminated remaining Plantagenet bloodlines that might challenge Tudor rule. As death approached, Henry attempted to secure his legacy through his will in the Act of Succession. He established a regency council to govern during his son Edward's minority, balancing conservative and reformist factions. The succession placed Edward first, followed by Mary and then Elizabeth, revealing Henry's pragmatic recognition that the Tudor dynasty might depend on female rule despite his lifelong quest for a male heir. Henry died on January 28, 1547, at Whitehall Palace. His final wishes for burial included an elaborate tomb with 40 life-sized bronze figures surrounding a large monument. Financial constraints and subsequent religious changes meant this grand design was never completed. Instead, Henry's remains rest in a relatively simple vault beneath St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, alongside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son. The king's legacy proved complex and contradictory. He had transformed England's religious landscape while personally adhering to many Catholic doctrines. He asserted English independence from foreign authority while creating unprecedented central power at home. He pursued dynastic security through multiple marriages that ultimately produced 3 successful monarchs, but none produced the stable male line he so desperately sought. Henry VIII left England dramatically different from the country he inherited, wealthier, more centralized, religiously reformed, and diplomatically significant. But these changes came at a tremendous human cost that revealed the darker aspects of absolute power. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, his 9-year-old son Edward became King Edward VI of England. The boy inherited not just a crown, but also the religious revolution his father had started. Unlike Henry, who maintained many Catholic practices while rejecting papal authority, Edward's regents embraced Protestant theology fully and implemented sweeping reforms that transformed English religious life. Edward Seymour, the young king's maternal uncle, quickly secured the position of Lord Protector and created himself Duke of Somerset. As regent, Somerset pursued moderate Protestant reforms while attempting to maintain political stability. He passed legislation dissolving chantries, institutions where priests said masses for the dead, redirecting their considerable wealth to the crown. Somerset also removed restrictions on printing and reading the Bible, allowing greater access to Scripture, a fundamental Protestant principle. The most significant religious development under Somerset came in 1549, with the First Book of Common Prayer. Drafted primarily by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, this book standardized worship throughout England, replacing the Latin Mass with English language services. The book represented a careful compromise, preserving enough traditional elements to avoid alienating conservatives while incorporating Protestant theology. This balance proved difficult to maintain, as reformers demanded more radical changes and traditionalists resisted innovations. These religious transformations triggered significant popular resistance. In Devon and Cornwall, the Prayer Book Rebellion erupted when locals demanded the return of traditional Latin services. Simultaneously, in Norfolk, Robert Kett led thousands of commoners protesting economic grievances, including enclosure of common lands by wealthy landowners. Somerset's relatively lenient approach to these uprisings contributed to his political downfall. In October 1549, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland, orchestrated Somerset's removal from power. Under Dudley's leadership, religious reforms accelerated. The Second Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1552, eliminated many remaining Catholic elements. Stone altars were replaced with wooden communion tables, elaborate vestments disappeared, and services emphasized scripture and preaching rather than ritual. These changes pushed England firmly toward Protestant practice, despite significant popular attachment to traditional religion. Throughout these tumultuous years, Edward VI was not merely a passive figurehead. The young king kept a detailed journal documenting government actions, diplomatic meetings, and even executions. His writing reveals a precocious intellect and strong Protestant convictions. Foreign ambassadors frequently commented on his religious knowledge, with one reporting that Edward debated theological points with bishops when he was only 10 years old. His education under Renaissance humanists gave him proficiency in Latin, Greek, French, and deep familiarity with Protestant thought. Edward's personal faith aligned with the reforms implemented in his name. He once wrote a treatise against papal supremacy and frequently attended sermons by leading Protestant preachers. Unlike his father, who maintained traditional views on transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine become Christ's actual body and blood during communion, Edward embraced the Reformed view that communion was a memorial rather than a mystical transformation. By early 1553, Edward's health began deteriorating rapidly. Symptoms suggest tuberculosis, though some historians propose other conditions. As his condition worsened, Edward and his advisors faced a succession crisis. His half-sister Mary remained firmly Catholic and would likely reverse the religious reforms if she became queen. Working with Northumberland, Edward drafted a device for the succession that bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law and Edward's Protestant cousin. When Edward died on July 6, 1553, at just 15 years old, the attempted succession plan collapsed within days. Mary secured the throne, and England faced another dramatic religious reversal. Despite his brief reign, Edward's Protestant reforms established foundations that would eventually return under Elizabeth I, creating the distinctive religious identity that shaped England for centuries to come. By early 1553, the reality of Edward VI's declining health created a constitutional crisis. The 15-year-old king, ravaged by what historians now believe was tuberculosis, watched his life slipping away with growing concern. Not for himself, but for the Protestant Reformation he had championed since taking the throne at age 9. Edward knew his Catholic half-sister Mary stood next in line for succession, and he feared everything he had built would be dismantled. In his final months, Edward crafted a document known as the Device for the Succession. This legal instrument bypassed both his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. At 16, Jane had impressive royal credentials. She was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary and had Tudor blood flowing through her veins. More importantly to Edward's Protestant council, she was a committed reformist. Behind this succession plan stood the ambitious John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. As Lord President of Edward's Privy Council, Northumberland had consolidated enormous power. He had also conveniently married his son Guildford to Lady Jane just weeks before, ensuring his family would remain at the center of power. The plan seemed perfect on paper. Edward would die, Jane would ascend, and Protestant reforms would continue under Northumberland's guidance. When Edward died on July 6, 1553, events unfolded rapidly. Jane was summoned to Sion House and informed she was now Queen of England. Her reaction reveals much about her character. She collapsed in shock, weeping and declaring she was not sufficient for such responsibility. Nevertheless, she was proclaimed Queen on July 10th and moved to the Tower of London to await her coronation. Jane's reluctance wasn't mere modesty. She was a serious intellectual who had received one of the finest humanist educations available to anyone in Tudor England. She spoke and wrote Latin, Greek, and Hebrew with remarkable fluency. Her correspondence with Protestant reformers across Europe demonstrated sophisticated theological understanding that impressed even university-trained scholars. Her teacher, Roger Ascombe, later wrote that finding Jane reading Plato in Greek while the rest of the household went hunting was one of the most memorable sights of his life. But Jane's reign lasted just 9 days. Mary Tudor, learning of her brother's death, gathered supporters in East Anglia, where Catholic sympathies remained strong. As she marched toward London, something remarkable happened. People rallied to her cause in surprising numbers. Even Protestant nobles abandoned Northumberland, recognizing his power grab for what it was. By July 19th, Mary entered London triumphantly, while Jane remained imprisoned in the Tower. Initially, Mary showed mercy toward Jane, viewing her as a pawn in Northumberland's scheme, rather than a willing usurper. Northumberland himself was swiftly executed after a failed attempt to capture Mary. Jane and her husband remained imprisoned but alive, their fate uncertain. Mary's clemency might have held, but in January 1554, Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, joined Wyatt's rebellion against the Queen. This sealed Jane's fate. On February 12, 1554, Jane watched from her tower window as her husband was led to execution on Tower Hill. Hours later, she herself faced the axe within the tower's walls. Witnesses reported that she died with remarkable composure, reciting Psalm 51 before laying her head on the block. Her final words, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," reflected the deep faith that had guided her brief life. Jane's 9-day reign represents one of history's most poignant footnotes. A brilliant young woman thrust unwillingly onto a throne she never sought, then executed for a plot she never designed. In her, we see not just a failed queen, but perhaps the Tudor dynasty's greatest intellectual, sacrificed to the religious and political conflicts that defined her age. Mary Tudor entered London in August 1553, to a city decorated with banners and cheering crowds. After years of living under threat during her brother's reign, the 37-year-old daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon now held power as England's first crowned queen regnant. Her triumph represented more than personal vindication. It signaled the beginning of a religious counter-revolution that would earn her the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary's primary mission was clear from the start: restore England to the Catholic faith. She moved methodically, first reinstating conservative bishops who had been imprisoned under Edward VI. Parliament quickly repealed the Protestant religious legislation of her brother's reign, and by 1554, England formally reconciled with Rome. Pope Julius III celebrated the news, though Mary's government ensured that former church lands remained with their new owners, recognizing that complete restoration of pre-Reformation property would be politically impossible. The Queen's decision to marry Philip II of Spain in July 1554 proved deeply unpopular. England had long viewed Spain as a rival, and many feared Spanish domination of English affairs. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion in Kent against the match, marching toward London with several thousand men. Though Mary's forces defeated the rebels, the uprising revealed widespread anxiety about her foreign policy. Philip arrived in England that summer amid elaborate celebrations, but was received coolly by the English people. What truly defined Mary's reign in historical memory was her treatment of religious dissenters. Beginning in 1555, her government revived medieval heresy laws and began trying prominent Protestant leaders. The first to burn was John Rogers in February 1555, followed by Bishop John Hooper. Over the next 3 years, around 300 men and women would be executed by fire across England, among them Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had presided over Henry VIII's annulment from Mary's mother. These executions followed a calculated pattern. The government staged them in market towns and cities to maximize their public impact. Authorities published accounts of the trials, hoping to demonstrate the righteousness of their cause. Yet evidence suggests this strategy backfired severely. Even many committed Catholics found the spectacle disturbing. One Spanish observer noted that the people were astonished at such great cruelty, and the preachers could not convince them that those who were being burned were heretics. The most consequential witness to these events was John Foxe, who documented the Protestant martyrs in his massive Acts and Monuments, better known as the Book of Martyrs. His vivid accounts of suffering transformed the victims into heroes of faith, creating a Protestant martyrology that shaped English identity for generations. After Mary's death, Foxe's book became required reading in English parishes, cementing her reputation as a persecutor. Despite her religious zeal, Mary's reign faced multiple crises. England lost Calais, its last continental possession, to the French in 1558. Severe harvests in 1555 and 1556 led to food shortages and inflation. Most critically, Mary failed to produce an heir despite 2 false pregnancies. These phantom pregnancies became a source of both personal anguish and political uncertainty. In 1554, Mary stopped menstruating and developed a swollen abdomen, classic signs of pregnancy. The court prepared for a birth, but months passed with no child. A similar episode occurred in 1557. Modern historians suggest these were cases of pseudocyesis, false pregnancy, or possibly symptoms of ovarian cysts or uterine cancer, the latter potentially explaining her death in November 1558. When Mary died at age 42, her 5-year restoration of Catholicism remained incomplete. Without an heir, the crown passed to her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth, effectively undoing much of Mary's religious legacy. The Catholic queen, who had survived decades of religious turmoil, ultimately failed to secure her faith's future in England. On November 17, 1558, Elizabeth Tudor became queen at the age of 25. As she received news of her sister's death at Hatfield House, she reportedly quoted Psalm 118, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." The kingdom she inherited was in disarray. Religious policies had swung violently between Henry VIII's moderate reforms, Edward VI's radical Protestantism, and Mary's Catholic restoration. These shifts led the English people divided, uncertain, and weary of persecution. Elizabeth's first months on the throne revealed her political instincts. She appointed William Cecil, a moderate Protestant, as her Secretary of State, but retained several Catholic nobles on her Privy Council. This balanced approach signaled her intention to find middle ground in a polarized nation. Unlike her predecessors, Elizabeth seemed to understand that religious stability, not doctrinal purity, was the path to a secure reign. The 1559 religious settlement formed the cornerstone of Elizabeth's approach to church governance. The process wasn't smooth. The legislation faced significant opposition in the House of Lords, particularly from Catholic bishops. The settlement contained two key acts. The Act of Supremacy re-established royal authority over the church, but with a crucial modification. Elizabeth took the title Supreme Governor rather than Supreme Head, a subtle but important distinction that acknowledged theological objections to a woman leading the church. The Act of Uniformity restored a slightly modified version of the 1552 Book of Common Prayer and mandated its use in all English parishes. The prayer book preserved enough traditional elements to satisfy conservatives, while incorporating Reformed theology to appease Protestants. Under this system, attending church services became a civic obligation. The law required weekly attendance at Anglican services, with fines for those who refused. Elizabeth's religious policy has often been described as the via media, or middle way. It established a distinctly English form of Protestantism that retained episcopal structure, clerical vestments, and many traditional ceremonies while embracing Reformed theology. This approach allowed her to navigate the dangerous religious divisions that were tearing apart other European nations. While France descended into decades of civil wars between Catholics and Huguenots, and the Holy Roman Empire faced similar conflicts, England maintained relative religious peace. The practical application of the settlement revealed Elizabeth's political genius. She insisted on outward conformity while showing little interest in policing private beliefs. As she famously declared, she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. This approach allowed many Catholics to attend Anglican services while maintaining their private devotions at home. It also let radical Protestants comply with official practice while advocating for further reforms. The settlement pleased few religious purists. Radical Protestants, later known as Puritans, believed the reforms didn't go far enough in eliminating popish elements. Catholics, meanwhile, faced increasing restrictions, especially after Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570. Nevertheless, the compromise worked because it demanded only external compliance rather than internal conviction. Elizabeth's coronation on January 15, 1559, foreshadowed her religious policies through carefully choreographed symbolism. The ceremony combined traditional elements with Protestant innovations. During her procession through London, pageants displayed the religious direction of the new reign. One particularly striking tableau featured a child representing truth rising from a cave and presenting the Queen with an English Bible. Elizabeth received it with reverence, kissing it and holding it to her chest, a powerful visual statement of her Protestant intentions. The stability provided by the earlier religious settlement allowed culture, literature, and exploration to flourish in Elizabeth's later reign. Freed from religious turmoil, England embraced a confident national identity that inspired artistic achievement, maritime ambition, and the shaping of a distinctly English worldview. Throughout Elizabeth I's reign, one figure loomed as both a living threat and potent symbol: Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Their relationship represented a dynastic chess match with religious warfare as the backdrop. As Elizabeth's cousin and a Catholic with Tudor blood, Mary embodied the hopes of those who viewed Elizabeth as illegitimate, a heretic queen whose mother's marriage to Henry VIII had never been valid in Catholic eyes. Mary arrived in England in 1568 under extraordinary circumstances. Once Queen of both Scotland and France, she had been forced to abdicate the Scottish throne after a series of scandals, including her suspected involvement in her husband Lord Darnley's murder. Fleeing rebel Scottish lords, she crossed the border seeking Elizabeth's protection. Instead, she found herself a prisoner, moved between various castles and manors for the next 19 years. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma with Mary. Releasing her might trigger civil war, but executing a fellow monarch would set a dangerous precedent. Mary's presence became a magnetic pole for Catholic resistance. In 1569, the Northern Rebellion erupted when Catholic nobles in northern England rose up, intending to free Mary and restore Catholicism. Though crushed by Elizabeth's forces, it demonstrated the Scottish Queen's symbolic power. The stakes escalated dramatically in 1570 when Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis. This declaration excommunicated Elizabeth, declared her a pretender, and released her subjects from any obligation to obey her. It effectively sanctioned her assassination. Catholic powers across Europe now had papal blessing to overthrow England's Protestant queen and replace her with Mary. A series of plots followed with alarming regularity. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 involved plans by an Italian banker to assassinate Elizabeth with Spanish military support and place Mary on the throne. In 1583, the Throckmorton plot aimed to coordinate a French invasion with Mary's supporters. Each conspiracy tightened restrictions around Mary and intensified paranoia at Elizabeth's court. The sophisticated intelligence apparatus that uncovered these plots was largely the creation of Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster. Walsingham employed a network of agents across Europe who intercepted communications, infiltrated Catholic seminaries, and broke encryption codes. His methods were remarkably modern. He established what amounted to a 16th century surveillance state, with coded messages and double agents protecting Elizabeth. The Babington plot of 1586 proved decisive. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman, conspired with fellow sympathizers to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. Walsingham's agents not only infiltrated the group, but manipulated their communications. When Mary responded to Babington's coded letter approving the assassination plan, Walsingham had the evidence he needed. The intercepted letter, in which Mary explicitly consented to Elizabeth's murder, sealed her fate. Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant in February 1587, after considerable hesitation. The execution at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8th became one of the Tudor era's most dramatic scenes. Mary dressed in black with a crimson petticoat, the color of Catholic martyrdom. After her beheading, witnesses discovered her small Skye Terrier had hidden beneath her skirts. The dog refused to leave her body and had to be forcibly removed, adding a poignant detail to an already dramatic scene. Mary's execution eliminated the most serious dynastic threat to Elizabeth's rule. Yet it also transformed Mary into a Catholic martyr and gave Spain additional justification for launching the Armada the following year. Elizabeth claimed she had never intended the warrant to be carried out so quickly and temporarily banished her secretary, William Davison, to the Tower for executing it without final confirmation. The decades-long struggle between these two queens, one who ruled by pragmatism and one who lived by passion, demonstrates how personal rivalries and religious conflicts intertwined in Tudor politics. Mary's death marked the final defeat of domestic Catholic resistance, allowing Elizabeth to focus on external threats like Spain. In 1588, relations between England and Spain reached their breaking point. King Philip II of Spain, once the husband of England's Catholic Queen Mary, had grown increasingly hostile toward Elizabeth I. He viewed her as a heretic queen who supported Dutch rebels against Spanish rule and permitted English privateers to raid Spanish treasure ships. Philip decided on a bold strategy, a massive naval invasion to depose Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England. The Spanish Armada consisted of 130 ships carrying approximately 30,000 men. The plan seemed straightforward. The Armada would sail up the English Channel, link with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, and escort these troops across the Channel for an invasion of England. Philip called it his Enterprise of England, and many across Catholic Europe believed it would succeed. England faced this threat with a navy of about 200 ships, though many were smaller than their Spanish counterparts. The English fleet had several advantages, however. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable, designed for the rough Atlantic rather than the Mediterranean. They also carried longer-range guns that could fire heavier shot. The English commanders, Lord Howard of Effingham, Sir Francis Drake, and John Hawkins, were experienced sailors who knew their home waters. When the Armada entered the English Channel in July 1588, the English adopted a strategy of harassment rather than direct engagement. They followed the Spanish formation, attacking stragglers and testing weaknesses, while preventing the Spanish from establishing a position to receive Parma's troops. The Spanish ships formed a defensive crescent formation that proved difficult to break. The decisive moment came when the Armada anchored at Calais to await communication with Parma's forces. The English prepared 8 fireships, vessels filled with pitch, gunpowder, and combustible materials, and sent them with the tide into the tightly packed Spanish fleet. Though none of the Spanish ships caught fire, the threat forced them to cut their anchor cables and scatter, breaking their careful formation. The following day, the English engaged the disorganized Spanish fleet off Gravelines. The battle lasted 8 hours, with English ships firing from distance while staying beyond the range of Spanish guns. Several Spanish ships were sunk, and others damaged beyond repair. Unable to return to Calais due to winds and tides, the Armada was forced northward into the North Sea. What followed exceeded the damage of battle. Attempting to return to Spain by sailing around Scotland and Ireland, the Armada encountered severe storms. Many ships wrecked on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Survivors who reached shore in Ireland were often killed by English forces or hostile locals. Of the original 130 ships, only about 60 returned to Spain. The human cost was staggering. While England lost no ships and fewer than 100 men, Spain lost approximately 11,000 sailors and soldiers to battle, disease, starvation, drowning, and execution as castaways. More men died from the journey's hardships than from English cannons. While expecting the invasion, Elizabeth visited her troops at Tilbury, where she delivered her most famous speech. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." This moment transformed her image from simply a political leader to a warrior queen defending her realm. The Armada's defeat marked a turning point in Elizabeth's reign and in European power dynamics. While Spain remained powerful, its aura of invincibility was shattered. England's naval reputation soared, setting the stage for its future as a maritime power. Drake's legendary calmness, continuing his game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe when first informed of the Armada's approach, became symbolic of English composure in the face of danger, a story retold through generations as part of the national myth of Elizabethan England. The period following the Spanish Armada's defeat marked the flowering of what historians called the Elizabethan Golden Age. With external threats diminished, England experienced a cultural renaissance that transformed not just the arts, but the very concept of English identity. This era saw the emergence of a distinctly English cultural expression that separated itself from continental European traditions. At the center of this cultural explosion stood the theatre. Before Elizabeth's reign, English drama consisted primarily of religious mystery plays and simple morality tales. By the 1590s, London housed multiple permanent theatres, including the Theatre, the Curtain, the Rose, and most famously, the Globe. These wooden, open-air structures attracted thousands of spectators from all social classes, from groundlings who paid a penny to stand in the yard to wealthy patrons in covered galleries. The plays performed at these venues revolutionized storytelling. William Shakespeare produced approximately 37 plays during this period that explored the human condition with unprecedented psychological depth. His histories like Richard III and Henry V helped forge national mythology, while tragedies such as Hamlet and Macbeth examined the complexities of power and ambition. Christopher Marlowe, before his murder at age 29, created morally complex protagonists in works like Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine. Other playwrights, including Ben Jonson, Thomas Kyd, and John Webster, contributed to this dramatic flowering. Poetry also flourished under Elizabeth. Edmund Spenser's epic, The Faerie Queene, allegorically celebrated the Tudor Dynasty. Sonnets became fashionable, with Shakespeare and Philip Sidney creating sequences that expanded the form's emotional range. The Queen herself wrote poetry, though primarily in private. Elizabeth deliberately cultivated this artistic environment, recognizing its political value. She maintained a court of exceptional intellectuals, artists, and musicians. The arts helped promote royal authority and national pride. Portraits depicted her as the Virgin Queen, surrounded by symbols of purity and power. Her appearances at court masques and entertainments reinforced her image as the nation's symbolic mother. The age witnessed significant maritime expansion. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 brought immense profit and national prestige. The voyage returned with Spanish treasure worth approximately £160,000, about half the crown's annual revenue. Investors received a 4,700% return on their initial investment, while Drake himself gained wealth and knighthood from the Queen. Martin Frobisher and John Davis searched for the Northwest Passage, while Sir Walter Raleigh attempted the first English colony in North America at Roanoke. These explorations reflected growing interest in the natural world. John Dee, Elizabeth's court astrologer, collected mathematical instruments and promoted practical applications of science. The era saw advances in navigation, cartography, and astronomy, though England lagged behind continental Europe in pure scientific theory. Elizabeth's self-presentation became an art form itself. Her elaborate costumes featured symbolic imagery and overwhelming ornamentation. She wore wigs to maintain her image of youthful vitality and applied white lead makeup to achieve a pale complexion associated with nobility. Her famous rainbow portrait shows her dress decorated with eyes and ears, symbolizing her omniscience, while she holds a rainbow representing peace. The concept of Englishness crystallized during this period. The Protestant religion, the English language, increasingly standardized through the Book of Common Prayer and growing literacy, and a sense of historical distinctiveness combined to create national consciousness. After centuries of trying to reclaim French territories, England began to embrace its island identity and maritime potential. This cultural confidence reached its height in the later years of Elizabeth's reign, establishing patterns of art, thought, and identity that would influence English and later British culture for centuries. The Elizabethan Golden Age created a foundation for future national development through its unique combination of artistic achievement, exploration, and evolving sense of collective identity. The 1590s began a period of slow decline for Elizabeth I. While her reign had reached its zenith with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, her final years brought mounting challenges that tested even her remarkable political skills. Her personal losses began with the death of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, in 1588. Dudley had been her close companion for 30 years, and his absence created an emotional void that was never filled. By 1590, Sir Francis Walsingham, her brilliant spymaster, also died, followed by William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, in 1598. These deaths deprived Elizabeth of her most trusted advisors, just when she needed them most. The Queen's financial situation deteriorated steadily. Persistent conflict with Spain stretched royal resources thin, while military campaigns in Ireland proved both costly and frustrating. The 9 Years' War in Ireland, 1593 to 1603, required 18,000 troops at its peak and drained the treasury of nearly £2 million, an enormous sum that represented multiple years of crown revenue. Attempts to raise money through monopolies on common goods, like salt and starch, generated public resentment. England also suffered economic hardships. The harvest failures of 1594 to 1597 caused food prices to rise sharply. Inflation decreased the purchasing power of ordinary people, while taxation remained heavy. The Queen's once generous Parliament grew reluctant to approve new subsidies, forcing her to sell crown lands to raise cash. These economic pressures fueled popular discontent in her final years. Elizabeth's court atmosphere changed markedly. The vibrant, flirtatious dynamic that characterized her earlier reign gave way to a more somber environment. New courtiers like Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, tried to recapture the romantic politics of earlier decades, but lacked the subtlety of their predecessors. Essex, once Elizabeth's favorite, proved increasingly unstable. His unauthorized return from Ireland in 1599 and subsequent house arrest foreshadowed his final act of desperation, an attempted rebellion in London in 1601. Elizabeth had no choice but to sign his death warrant, a decision that reportedly haunted her final years. Elizabeth's self-presentation, once a masterwork of political theater, became increasingly difficult to maintain. Though she still appeared in magnificent gowns adorned with jewels for public ceremonies, her physical decline was impossible to conceal completely. She reportedly owned approximately 2,000 dresses at her death, yet ordered all mirrors removed from her private chambers. The Queen, who had once danced for 6 hours without tiring, now required her courtiers to support her when she walked. The succession question remained unresolved publicly. Elizabeth refused to name an heir, reportedly declaring that "I will have no rascal to succeed me, and who should succeed me but a king?" Yet behind the scenes, her government initiated secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. By 1601, an informal understanding existed that James would succeed Elizabeth, though the Queen never acknowledged this arrangement openly. In March 1603, Elizabeth's health declined rapidly. She developed what modern historians believe was bronchial pneumonia. Refusing to take to her bed, some accounts suggest she stood for nearly 3 days. Elizabeth eventually allowed her ladies to place cushions on the floor, where she reclined. She remained largely silent during her final days, speaking only occasionally to her closest attendants. When Archbishop Whitgift urged her to seek comfort and prayer, she reportedly replied that all her thoughts were fixed on God. Elizabeth died in the early hours of March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old and had reigned for 44 years. Within hours, Cecil's son Robert dispatched a messenger to Scotland, announcing James's succession. The transition occurred without violence or resistance, a remarkable achievement considering the bloody succession struggles that had plagued England for centuries. The peaceful transition to the Stuart dynasty represented Elizabeth's final gift to her kingdom, concluding the Tudor era not with chaos, but with order. When Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace on March 24, 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended after 118 years. Within hours of her death, Sir Robert Cecil, who had been secretly corresponding with Scotland, announced that James VI of Scotland would become James I of England. The news spread quickly through London, with proclamations read at major crossroads and public spaces. England had no native-born heir to the throne for the first time since Henry VII seized the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485. James's claim to the English throne came through his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. The Scottish king was technically not the closest blood relative. That distinction belonged to Lady Arbella Stuart, but Elizabeth's government had quietly determined he was the most suitable successor. At age 36, James had already ruled Scotland for 36 years, having become king when he was only 13 months old. His experience in governance, Protestant faith, and male gender made him preferable to other candidates. The transition between these dynasties happened with remarkable smoothness. No armed conflicts erupted, no rival claimants raised armies, and the government continued functioning without interruption. The peaceful succession stood in stark contrast to previous transfers of power, particularly the Wars of the Roses that had brought the Tudors to power a century earlier. The Elizabethan government's quiet preparation created conditions for stability during a potentially dangerous moment in English history. James left Edinburgh for London on April 5, 1603, traveling south through towns and counties that had never seen their monarch. His journey became a grand progression, lasting over a month. The new king stopped at the homes of Protestant nobles, enjoying lavish entertainment and hunting expeditions. At each stop, local officials presented him with gifts and petitions. James, pleased with his warm reception, responded by distributing knighthoods liberally, so many that courtiers began calling it his knighting disease. In Newark alone, he knighted 80 men in a single ceremony, devaluing an honor that had once required significant military or political service. Though England's transition to Stuart rule proceeded peacefully, James faced serious challenges. He had survived at least 8 assassination attempts in Scotland, where factional politics often turned violent. His safety concerns would prove justified when Catholic conspirators planned the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, attempting to blow up Parliament with the king inside. The plot's discovery reinforced anti-Catholic sentiments and demonstrated the religious tensions James inherited. The Tudors had transformed England's governmental structure, strengthening centralized authority and reducing noble power. Yet they left unresolved questions about the relationship between monarch and parliament. Elizabeth had carefully managed these tensions through political skill and personal charisma. James, however, brought different ideas about kingship from Scotland. He advocated the divine right of kings, writing scholarly treatises on the subject. His belief that monarchs were answerable only to God would eventually create friction with Parliament that his son Charles I would escalate to civil war. The end of the Tudor era also marked cultural shifts. The distinctly English Renaissance that flourished under Elizabeth gave way to continental influences. James patronized scholarship rather than drama, preferring academic debate to theatrical spectacle. Scientific inquiry gained prominence, with Francis Bacon developing empirical methods that would revolutionize knowledge acquisition. The king sponsored a new Bible translation, published in 1611, that would influence English language and thought for centuries. England in 1603 stood at a turning point, no longer the isolated island nation fighting for survival, but increasingly engaged with global exploration and commerce. The Tudor legacy of religious settlement, governmental centralization, and cultural development provided the foundation upon which the Stuarts would build a united British state and eventually an empire that spanned the globe. The Tudors reshaped England, religion, power, and identity, all in just 5 monarchs. Their legacy still echoes today. If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more epic history told like never before.